Almost everywhere you look, the left is in ruins. Of the 27 countries of the European Union, only a handful have left-of-center parties leading government coalitions.
What's up, Black Coffee crew? The apparent collapse of the left, not just here in the US, but across the globe. Now, I know that sounds like a bold claim, but we're gonna break down some hard truths with the help of a recency and commentary that's been making waves. Let's get into it.
And now, here's my take. Countries with more than half of the world's population went to the polls last year, and the basic message they sent to their governments was one of dissatisfaction and anger with the status quo. Their frustration, however, seemed to be particularly focused on the party that has traditionally been identified with big government, the left. Almost everywhere you look, the left is in ruins. Of the 27 countries of the European Union, only a handful have left-of-center parties leading government coalitions. The primary left-of-center party in the European Parliament now has just 136 seats in a 720-seat chamber. Even in countries that have been able to stem the rise of right-wing populism, like Poland, it is the center-right that is thriving, not the left. And in the US, of course, the breadth of Donald Trump's victory, nearly 90% of counties in America moved right, suggests that it is very much part of this trend. The crisis of democratic government, then, is actually a crisis of progressive government. People seem to feel that they have been taxed, regulated, bossed around, and intimidated by left-of-center politicians for decades, but the results are bad and have been getting worse.
So this CNN host, Fareed Zakaria, and I've got to give him credit for saying what many are thinking, went on a tear about the current state of the Democratic Party and the broader left-wing political movement. He didn't hold back, folks. He argues that almost everywhere you look, the left is in ruins. He suggests that the frustration and anger with the status quo is focused on the left. He points out that in Europe, only a few countries have left-of-center parties leading government coalitions. Even in places where right-wing populism hasn't taken hold, it's the center-right that's thriving, not the left. And he makes a point about the trend in the US, noting that almost 90% of counties moved to the right during the Trump era.
New York, where I live, and Florida, where I visit often, provide an interesting contrast. They have similar-sized populations, New York with about 20 million people, Florida with about 23 million. But New York State's budget is more than double that of Florida's, $239 billion versus roughly $116 billion. In addition, New York City, which is a little more than 3 times the size of Miami-Dade County, has a budget of more than $100 billion, which is nearly 10 times that of Miami-Dade. New York City's spending grew from 2012 to 2019 by over 40%, 4 times the rate of inflation. Does any New Yorker feel that he or she got 40% better services during that time? What do New Yorkers get for these vast sums of money generated by the highest tax rates in the country? If you're well off in New York City, you pay nearly as much in income taxes as in London, Paris, or Berlin, without free higher education or health care, I might add. New York's poverty rate is higher than Florida's. New York has a lower rate of home ownership and a much higher rate of homelessness. Despite spending more than twice as much on education per student, New York has education outcomes, graduation rates, 8th grade test scores, that are roughly the same as Florida's.
Now, why is this happening? According to the CNN host, people feel that they've been taxed, regulated, bossed around, and intimidated by left-of-center politicians for decades, with poor results. It's not just about policy. It's about results. Let's talk specifics. The host compared New York, a liberal state, with Florida, a conservative one. This is where it gets interesting. Both states have similar populations, but New York's budget is more than double that of Florida's, and New York City's budget is nearly 10 times that of Miami-Dade County, even though it's only a little more than 3 times the size of Miami-Dade. New York City's spending grew by over 40% from 2012 to 2019, 4 times the rate of inflation. The host asks, did New Yorkers get 40% better services during that time? Despite spending much more per student on education, New York's educational outcomes are roughly the same as Florida's. New York also has a higher poverty rate, lower home ownership, and a much higher rate of homelessness.
It's easy to comfort oneself by thinking that these sky-high tax rates and growing government revenues are providing some crucial ingredients of progressive government. But they are often simply the toll of waste and mismanagement. The first phase of the Second Avenue subway's construction at $2.5 billion per mile was 8 to 12 times more expensive compared to a sampling of similar projects in places like Italy, Sweden, Paris, and Berlin, not exactly low-cost locales. A large chunk of state and city tax revenues goes to fund pensions. In Illinois, more than 8% of the budget goes towards pensions. In New York City, nearly 22% of the budget funds pensions and benefits for government workers. Now, promising government workers generous pensions has been an easy way to buy the support of a crucial voting bloc while ensuring that the costs don't show up in the budgets until years later. America's big cities are incubators of growth, vitality, and energy. That's why the spotlight is placed on them and their governance. And what people have seen recently is liberalism run amok. For years, theft was rampant in California's cities because of a weak shoplifting law. New York's homeless, some of whom are drug addicts or mentally ill, are left to frighten and harass the public on the streets and in the subways. The man charged this week with attempted murder after pushing another man in front of the subway had a string of prior arrests. The ultimate test, of course, is how people are voting with their feet. For years now, New York has been losing people to states like Florida. This same story can be told with minor variations about California and Texas. Basically, big red states are growing at the expense of big blue states, which will translate politically into more Republican representation in Congress and more electoral votes. There's now an interesting effort by people like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to combine cultural conservatism and economic nationalism with the radical reform of government. That could be an appealing ideology for many voters who are frustrated by a government where nothing seems to work that well. On the other side, if Democrats do not learn some hard lessons from the poor governance in many blue cities and states, they will be left defending cultural elites, woke ideology, and bloated, inefficient government. And that might be a formula for permanent minority status.
Now, the host didn't just tear down the left. He offered a possible alternative. He mentioned that people like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are trying to combine cultural conservatism and economic nationalism with the radical reform of government. He argues that this could appeal to voters frustrated by a government where nothing seems to work. The CNN host essentially makes the case for a more efficient government and says it is better than Trump or even Elon could. The core of the issue, according to this commentary, is that if Democrats don't address these issues and take a hard look at themselves, they might become a permanent minority. The presenter argues that the far-left policies are just being rejected by the culture. This isn't just speculation. He notes that 90% of counties in America move to the right, even in deep blue states like California and Illinois. The Democrats may be losing the support of people who had previously voted for them. He points out that even 40% of Californians and 45% of Illinois residents voted for Trump in the last election. That's a significant shift. And here's another interesting point. The host talks about how European leaders respect Trump's leadership, even if they don't like him, because they can't take advantage of him. He notes that President Zelensky of Ukraine said that all the European leaders ask about Trump after he interacts with him, which shows that they think of him as a serious person. The CNN host also brings up Trump's interest in Greenland. He argues that Greenland's push for independence from Denmark could be a sign they are open to a deal with the US and want to negotiate directly with America. He points out that the Chinese and Russians are being aggressive in the Arctic and that the US needs to have more influence in the region. So what does all this mean? It means we are at a political crossroads. The left's grip on power seems to be slipping, not just in America but globally. The CNN host's commentary is a wake-up call, highlighting deep-seated problems with the current political landscape. Are we seeing a permanent shift in the political paradigm? The sources would suggest that is what is currently unfolding. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Is the left in ruins? Are we headed for a major political realignment? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. We need to keep this conversation going. This is Black Coffee, signing off.
It won't be long because Europe will be looking at us and will be looking at Trump. And by the way, I now see that when I talk about something with Donald Trump, whether we meet in person or we just have a call, all the European leaders always ask, how was it? This shows the influence of Donald Trump. And this has never happened before. With an American president, I tell you from my experience, this also gives you confidence, that he can stop this war.
I'm not sure it's necessarily about U.S. sovereignty over Greenland, but I think U.S. influence in the Arctic is extremely important. This is strategy. This is major high-level geopolitical strategy. You look at what our enemies are up to. You look at the Chinese. You look at the Russians together, that alliance or axis of the Chinese and the Russians. They are really aggressive in the Arctic. And the free world has to wake up and pay a lot of attention to that. And I think that's what Trump is getting at here, saying, hey, we would like to have more influence on this landmass.